So how do you think we can begin to theorize queerness in a way that is very specific to Africa?
I think the most effective tool of education has always been storytelling. And Africa understands that more than any other part of the world. So, you know, jargonistic academic papers appeal to specific professions and involve in-group conversations that tend to alienate those that are outside those disciplines. So stories, on the other hand, appeal to a broader audience. It was very important for me when producing African sexualities to reach a wider interdisciplinary audience and the general reader. The book provides a window through which to learn and theorize sexualities. So you have life stories, fiction, poetry, diary entries, and other expressions, which in my view was a very effective way to explore a subject matter as personal and as complex, as controversial as sexuality. It's politically important for Africans to tell their own stories on their own terms. So the African experience is quite distinct from that in North America, or Europe, Asia, or even South America. The fact that in Africa, erotic relations are usually formed through practice, through performance, and not through identities. So, you know, and additionally, they are more discrete. Sexual relations are more discrete than, you know, in your face. African sexual experiences are so diverse and multifaceted that a unifying theory would not capture their complexities. Indeed, political activism in Africa, which coalesces around homosexual identities or any of the other identities that make up the LGBTQ alphabet, originates from concepts that evolved outside the continent. So indigenous conceptualization of same-sex erotics generally had no desire to pin them down or to burden them with identities. They kept its content in flux and left it elusive.
Well, how do you fuse the reporting to the bigger story with the personal narratives, and why do you particularly think it's important to do so?
Thank you, Malcolm.
Important for you to do so?
Thank you, Malcolm. So this is the book, The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. It's just been published. And in a way,
I think, cover.
Thank you, I love it. I think that what I'm doing is similar to what Prof Sylvia is doing, where she works in the scholarly arena and is trying to find an African way of integrating globalized theories of sexuality through storytelling. And I don't work in the scholarly arena. I'm not an academic like Prof Sylvia. I'm a journalist and a writer, a South African journalist and writer. And my approach is also to use storytelling to try and understand what it means to be queer in the world today by following very closely the lives of various people across the world and trying to represent their stories as closely and as accurately as possible for a reader. And as you say, the first of these stories is a story of a woman named Tiwonga Chimbalanga, who was forced to flee Malawi when she held a public engagement ceremony with her fiance. Now, and then as a result of that, she was sentenced to 14 years hard labor. And when she was finally pardoned, she came to South Africa as an LGBTI refugee. Now, what's so fascinating about Auntie, as she's known, and what I'm trying to illuminate in telling her story, is that Auntie has always felt herself to be female and a woman. But depending on her context, her identity has changed, because identity is contextual, as I think Prof Sylvia has said. So in her home village, she was accepted by some as female, but seen to be bewitched by others as female. Once she goes to Blantyre, the capital of Malawi, and she holds this public engagement ceremony, and the media and the law finds out about it, she's known as gay. And she's prosecuted for carnal knowledge against the order of nature on the basis of her homosexuality, because she's seen to be a man who's marrying another man. That's why she goes to jail. Now then, to get her asylum status in South Africa, she has to take on this identity of transgender, which she'd never heard of before, and which doesn't really fit to her. She feels she's a woman. And this story is fascinating to me because it says to me what happens to our identities as Africans as we move from, no matter what kind of Africans we are, as we move from the local to the regional to the national to the global. And my book tries to sort of trace a pink line between the ways different parts of the world are dealing with gender identity and sexual orientation. And that pink line not only runs between Europe and Africa, in that Europe appears to be more accepting of alternative sexualities or gender identities, in Africa not so, but it actually runs through our continent too, and through our own identities as we toggle between a kind of online globalized identity that might come from the West and tell us that we have certain rights or freedoms or possibilities. If we take on this identity of gay or transgender, we have that online identity, but then we have the offline reality of our families, our communities, our churches, our states, where we have to contend with people who might be very opposed to who we are as we take on these new identities. So we become symbols of this Western colonial depredation on the one side. On the other side, you have people in the global North, in the West, who say, well, you know, what makes us civilized and them barbaric is that we support LGBT rights and they don't. So the people in the West are drawing a new line along old colonial battlegrounds between what is civilized and what is barbaric. Now, where does that leave you, Welcome? Where does that leave Otosierieze? Where does that leave me, who are people who are queer Africans? And this is really what I'm trying to understand in my book, and how the agency we have as queer Africans to turn that narrative around by living our own lives with our own truths, taking on, of course, and having to deal with what dominant discourses say about us, but working to transform those discourses too.
What's currently exciting you, or what are you looking forward to, or what are your thoughts and ideas of queer voices and queer literature at the moment in Africa?
I found there's this pattern that we used in reporting once it came to queer people. You wrote something about Chinelo Baranta, and there's always the tag of lesbian or queer following reports of Chinelo Baranta. But you don't find that when you write about people who essentially are writing about sex, heterosexual sex. You don't follow them up with that tag. So I thought it was interesting and something that needed to change, because while acknowledgement is important, it's even the ultimate goal is to normalize it in the way that we look at it. If every time we talk about something queer, we frame it through queer, which means, oh, it's different, then people are going to consciously think of it in that way. Even when they accept it, even when we talk about, oh, they are now accepting, they are always going to say, Under the Dollar Trees is a lesbian novel, Have a Yellow Song is a novel. The general thing is, the talent is there. We face the same problems that every other person faces, which is there's a lack of a system that is created to support you. In Nigeria, the system you have here is not created to support the young people. I mean, I have been saying this for years. It's sort of, it's like a political arm. It's set up to, I don't know, recruit you into some sort of propaganda something. And then if you are, which made it a lot difficult for people to get published. Because as of right now, you do not have a magazine, a formal literary magazine in Nigeria that has been publishing for up to a year. So that's like how bad. Brivica is not a magazine. So that's like how bad it is. So you find out, oh, if you are queer, you have a limited number of spaces where you could share your work. So these few spaces that are controlled by maybe, like a few people, and they become the only places you could go to. Let's say maybe the Arcade Festival. You go there, you could do anything you want. But aside that, there isn't any other place. Every other thing is online. In Nigeria, the first battle for us is against sexism and misogyny, because the battle against homophobia hasn't yet come to a place where people will actually, you know, where a greater percentage of the public is willing to accept that this is something wrong and that we need to fight.
If there's any similarity between our three great literary minds today, is that they have all judged the Gerald Kraak Anthology, which is a beautiful anthology that features queer voices from all over the continent. I would like to bring you in here and ask you to tell us a little bit about Gerald Kraak and his legacy, and also to touch on the importance of, you know, having a continental voice in this format of the Gerald Kraak Anthology.
The Gerald Kraak Anthology and Prize was set up by the Other Foundation, which is a regional philanthropy in Southern Africa, in the name of Gerald Kraak, who was a writer and a human rights activist, a published novelist, and perhaps somebody who's done more than anyone else to help seed and support LGBTQ movements in Southern Africa. When he died, the prize and anthology was set up in his name. And it's wonderful being on this discussion with both Sylvia and Otosierieze, because all three of us, together with Sisonke Msimang, have been judges of this prize over the last 2 years. And what the prize does is it asks for contributions from all over Africa for writing in any genre around sexuality, gender, and human rights. And it's extraordinary the talent that we have got through this prize, including Otosierieze's wonderful short story and Welcome Your Essay, both of which were published in Gerald Kraak anthologies. What's emerged out of them for me, and I'd love to hear what my fellow judges say about this, is a definition of what one of the winners, the winner of 2018, the Nigerian Pwangolongi Dawood, describes as a queer Afropolitanism, a critical voice, a resistant voice. It's fascinating, for example, that so many of these voices are coming from Nigeria, which, as we know, has one of the harshest anti-gay legislations on the continent. And so much of this voice is a voice of resistance. It's a voice of staking some territory where one's subjectivity is being denied. They're voices that are really engaging in the civic life and the politics of individual nations, but also the continent itself. The anthologies are published by Jacana. They should be more available online than they are. That's really one of the missions of the anthology in the upcoming year.
And Professor Sylvia, I was hoping if you could give us a kind of idea of what goes into the process of the judges selecting the final pieces that are published, because it felt like such a hearty process where my work was paid attention to with so much care. Can you tell us what goes into the selection of the works that have been submitted?
The entries are all blind judged, meaning that material sent to the judges without author details, except for the country of origin. Now, the chair of the panel of judges sifts through all the entries, and we end up with 15, but we get hundreds and hundreds of entries. So she sifts through all the entries, prepare a long list, organized by category. So we have nonfiction, academic or journalistic pieces, then fiction, we have poems, and photography. So we try as much as possible to have a balanced selection regionally. But over the years, Nigeria and South Africa have always been overrepresented simply because hundreds of applicants come from there. So then all the judges closely read the entries in the long list. Each one selecting what they think deserves to be shortlisted in each category. Then later we meet via Skype, and or today it would be Zoom, to discuss our shortlist. At this stage, we separate the entries into 3 main folders. The first one are clear choices, that is those that have been shortlisted by all 3 judges. Then what we may call the persuadables. If a piece has been selected by 1 or 2 judges, then they may persuade the others by pointing out the strength that they saw in the piece. And those others who didn't select it may revisit the piece and have minds. The aim is to build consensus. So if one judge feels very strongly against a piece, it will not make the finalists. Then the third category are what I may call the potentials. These are pieces that may be structurally weak or they may need some polishing. And if all of us as judges, the panel think that the piece has very good potential, then one of the judges will work with the author, of course with their consent, to develop and improve upon the piece. So as you can imagine, this can be very time-consuming and requires some funding. Finally, we submit the finalist of approximately 15 pieces of different genres to the other foundation and Jacana Foundation for publication.
Otosierieze, can you give us some advice to budding young writers who would like to get published in the anthology in the future, or just in general, some thoughts on some advice on what queer writers can be thinking about, or how they what's your advice to young queer budding writers?
Okay, so what we could glean from this our conversation so far. So Sylvia has talked about again, I keep returning to Sylvia's articulation of the absence of a unified theory in describing African sexualities. And Mark has spoken about how in the course of his research, the essence of the meaning of the pink line, what in this country looks like A, in the other country essentially looks like G or H, which means, there isn't a uniform thing when it comes to sexuality. It's just, the way that heterosexuality is. Because for me, ultimately, it's about normalization. So if we need to start from there, so if we're talking about queer writing, writing produced by people who biologically are queer, that is fine. But I tend to resist the idea of queer writing as artistic category. And I accept that there are tropes, there are, motives that keep running, there are ideas, but I want to resist that because, so if I would tell anybody, if you want to write a story, you want to submit to the Gerald Kraak Prize, just write a human story. I mean, queer people are human beings. You don't set out, because in Nigeria, people set out to say, oh, now I want to write queer fiction. And then I'm like, there is no such thing as queer fiction. I mean, I don't know, there is no such thing as queer fiction. There is fiction about queer people, which is just as fiction, about heterosexual people. So you want to write about, queer writing, just write about a human being who is queer. You could write about their queerness, how they're dealing with it, or you could write about how they are struggling to work at office. And we know they are queer, but that's not the point of the story. That too is visibility. And it's time we, everything. So I just keep remembering instances and I keep laughing. So my advice is write a human story. That's all, not a queer story. There's no such thing as queer fiction. So write a human story about queer people, period.
People who want to submit to the Kraak Anthology or Kraak Prizes, we now have rolling submissions, and they can do so by Googling Gerald Kraak Prize. That's GERALD KRAAK, or they can go to the website of Jacana, which is the publisher. That's JACANA. And I believe there will be another anthology. There's not an anthology this year, but I believe there will be another one next year.
And I'm really excited and look forward to what the anthology is going to look like in the coming future, because what you all have done with it so far has been an impeccable and I think a great start towards unifying the queer voice in Africa. With that, I would like to thank you all so much for being such wonderful panelists and for providing such insight into our queer lived experience in your writing and in this conversation. May you continue to be as brilliant and as awesome and fabulous as you are in your works. And thank you so much. I hope everyone who's watching was as informed and indulged as I was, and will continue to be informed and indulged with the other upcoming Pride of Freak projects.